Welcome everyone to LR lesson number 12. Today's subject is reconsidering eliminations. This is referring to situations where you've eliminated all five and now you have the unenviable task of going back to uneliminate at least one of them to move on. We'll be working out of PT 152, section 1, which according to the old numbering is PT 86, section 1. So why are we doing this today? As I was just saying, one of the worst parts, at least in my opinion, of LR is to seriously dislike, often to the point of elimination, all five answers for very specific reasons. A student recently brought PT 152 section 1, which again is PT 86 section 1 by the old numbering, to my attention. And the thing that I noticed about this section is that I felt like it put me into that position much more often than I considered usual for a given LR section. So my goal today, using just three questions, not all of the ones that I thought were terrible, but just three of the ones that I picked from this section, is to demonstrate various approaches to rehabilitating an answer that I disliked on the first pass. And to be frank, I don't even like much better on the second pass. So what this underlying process looks like in a nutshell is as follows. This is what I do. I retain overall cognizance of when I actively dislike an answer versus when I merely fail to understand it. So whenever it's the former, when I actually dislike an answer for a very specific reason, I feel pretty good about eliminating it. But sometimes just total confusing, merely failing to understand the answer, being totally lost about an answer choice is sometimes enough for me to eliminate it. But I do like to keep track of that, and this is not just for LR. This is also for RC. So that's why I gave it the 0 rating here in the list because it's something that I think is worth keeping track of, whatever you do on the exam. So with that sort of basis, I then move into the actual process itself, which is when I read the stimulus. So this is before I make my first pass through the answers. I form at least a low IQ expectation, excuse me, of what I want in a correct answer. So again, this happens before I even do answer choices. I want to have something in hand. Again, don't shoot for the most perfect prepackaged manufactured, symmetrical, whatever other adjective you want to use for it. Don't look for that nice, neat pre-phrase that looks like it came right out of an LSAT textbook. That's not what you need to do. Just have some basic expectations of like, what are the kinds of things that I want to see? That's enough. The next part of my process is to refuse to choose any answer choice that I consider to be less than a solid fit during my first pass through the answers. So again, before I go through any of the answer choices even once, I will try to have a set of expectations on hand. And once I start going through answer choices the first time, I'm keeping my standards very high. I don't want to pick anything that doesn't really speak to me or plug into um, the expectations that I came up. But of course, the whole reason we're here is that sometimes that first pass isn't enough. And so on second pass, I am ready to accept only partial alignment with my expectations. And again, this is during the second pass. If the first pass, if I'm being picky and I don't really see anything that really fits neatly, gotta loosen up a little bit on the second pass and start being a little bit more open-minded. The next thing I want to note is that if three isn't enough, this is what I move on to. I then become ready to accept something completely outside of my expectations. But this unexpected thing that I'm beginning to consider must be at least internally consistent. It can't be stupid for some other reason entirely unique to itself. And I just want to note here that very often this number four thing happens essentially simultaneously as number three during the second pass. I'm not making like a third pass through the answers with this. It's by the time I get through my second pass, I've probably rehabilitated one, maybe two answer choices, and they're still not that great. And so I need to sort of even further loosen my standards for answers, which is why I've kind of numbered it the way that I did. But yeah, don't be fooled. Three and four essentially happen at the same time in most situations. And finally, number five, the last thing that I want to add to this list is I learned to make peace with the fact that the rehabilitated answer is still objectionable. I don't try to convince myself to love it, ever. It's just that it's slightly less objectionable than the rest. That's all. I do want to make a note, and this does apply to basically everything on my channel here, but there is usually a more elegant, reverse engineered, kind of like publication ready sounding solution to almost everything that I do. And I don't care because this channel is all about trying to present the ugliness of a question as is, but finding a way to prevail, excuse me, over that ugliness nonetheless. Let's jump right into the first one, PT 152/86, Section 1, Question 14, which is a weakener. Which one of the following, if true, most weakens Pratt's argument? Well, let's see what happens. Let's see what Pratt has to say. Starting with the very first sentence, almost all cases of rabies in humans come from being bitten by a rabid animal, and bats do carry rabies. So, putting P1 and P2 together here, it seems to be telling us a straightforward story that it's at least not impossible for a bat to give us rabies just based on these two things alone. That's the vibe that I'm getting here. That bats could give us rabies if we learn more. We get kind of stalled in the conversation immediately here because it jumps to the conclusion, which is Pratt telling us that there is little justification for health warnings that urge the removal of any bats residing in buildings where people work or live. All right, so in Pratt's opinion, they're concluding here that we should not go hard against bats. There's not really a justification for us to go hard against indoor bats. And they kind of Pratt tacks on a couple extra premises here. After this conclusion, we do hear that bats are shy animals that rarely bite. And okay, and this does plug into the narrative given by P1 and P2, where sure, bats may have rabies in them, but since we seem to generally get rabies as humans through animals biting us, if these bats really very rarely bite us, are bats much of a rabies threat to begin with, right? And finally, we do also get a P4, and the overwhelming majority of bats do not even have rabies to begin with. So P3 and P4 now put together do offer a fairly stark contrast to P1 and P2. Again, P1 and P2 set up the at least baseline not impossibility of bats transmitting rabies to us, but we do hear that in P3 and P4 that the normal way that we would expect an animal, including bats, to give rabies to humans doesn't really seem like much of a threat. It probably isn't going to happen. And I kind of jumped the gun here. That was my analysis. Um, a weakener in this case, then, would have to do the following two things. Remember again before we dive into this that Pratt's conclusion is that we should not go all out against bats. So our weakener would have to give us some kind of justification to indeed go all out against any bats that we find indoors, even if P3 and P4 remain valid. I feel like um, these two premises do have to earn a mention at this point in my analysis because I feel like a weakener would somehow have to overcome these two properties of bats. Because P3 and P4, again, put together, pretty strongly suggest that bats really probably aren't going to be very good at giving us rabies. So we probably don't need to worry quite as much about that aspect of bats, right? And so a justification to be worried and to go real hard against bats, I think would have to overcome the potential objections that are raised by P3 and P4. So the expectation that I want to lay out is basically just the yellow stuff that I highlighted above. And again, I admit that it's kind of generic and kind of unhelpful. I know that. Because if you want to paraphrase my yellow stuff, it's basically like find a weakener that weakens, right? And that's really all it says. And so, yes, I do believe that having the yellow text in mind may be at least marginally helpful. I'm not going to pretend like it's like some big magical thing here that solves every problem. So pushing into my first pass through the answer choices. Let's look at A. A rabid bat is much more likely to infect another bat than to infect any other type of animal. I'm going to eliminate this one because, if anything, this is a strengthener as it makes it seem even less likely that bats present a rabies threat to humans. Because, as A says, if they usually end up giving it to other bats, humans are not other bats. And so, yeah, it just seems, it just kind of moves bat to human transmission even further down the list. To twist this into a weakener, to actually make it work, we'd have to do quite a bit. We'd have to invent some kind of narrative about, one or just a few rabbit bats, end up giving it to more bats, and now we have a bigger number of rabbit bats. And this unknown number of rabbit bats, I don't even know if there's some like critical mass of rabies carrying bats before they begin to, present a threat to humans. We don't know any of that. First of all, we don't even know how many bats we're dealing with, or if that amount of bats is enough to be a threat. We literally know nothing about that. And this literally know nothing, this unknown number of rabbit bats somehow still has to become a threat to humans despite what A says. In other words, the orange bit above does represent an insurmountable problem. So what if we have a ton of rabbit bats? If, as A says, if bats still generally give only rabies to other bats, we still have to invent yet another whole entire connective idea to connect we now have several rabid bats to now those bats are going to give them to humans. A has to work against itself to become weakener. So I really don't feel like there's a way to salvage this one. All right, let's push on to B, having already talked about A. So this is also an elimination for me. Rabid bats are less mobile than other bats, but are much more aggressive. And the reason for this elimination is just what I've written out already here. There's a point counterpoint mechanism in here that I do not know how to resolve. On the one hand, we hear rabid bats are less mobile. This seems consistent with the idea that, rabid bats aren't so much of a threat to humans angle that it's being set up by the argument by Pratt. On the other hand, though, we hear rabid bats are much more aggressive, which does make it seem more likely that rabid bats do in fact present a heightened threat against humans. The problem is that I don't know which point outweighs the other, and I refuse to play that game without any further information. There really is no room to interpret this any differently. There has to be this point counterpoint thing here because the less mobile point is quite literally presented as being in opposition to the much more aggressive point, thanks to the conjunction word but that connects these 2 points. And I know I can already hear the comments being typed. I know that they do, in fact, use the word much more aggressive versus just regularly less mobile. But at the same time, those things don't really mean anything, right? How much more aggressive is much more aggressive? And it's not like they attach numbers or anything to it where we know like it's 100 points towards more aggressive and, 50 points towards less mobile, so more aggressive wins. We just don't have anything that lets us judge, even if we take into account the fact that there is much more aggressiveness rather than, mobility lessening. It's just, we just don't know. We just don't know. So pushing it to C at this point. This is also an elimination. Most animals that carry rabies are animals of species that under normal conditions very rarely bite people. Because we don't know how we're supposed to react to these other animals that carry rabies, are we supposed to see them as threats? Are we supposed to not see them as threats? Is it justified to get rid of these other animals if we see even one inside a building, etc.? We just don't know how we're supposed to react to these other animals. Linking bats to these very same other animals fails to tell us anything about anything, really. Pushing into D, this is also an elimination. The bat species with the highest incidence of rabies do not live in buildings. This, if anything, is a strengthener. We know that bats in general usually don't have rabies. And if it turns out the few that do have rabies probably aren't even indoors, that actually gives us even less reason and less justification to hate on indoor bats. And remember, that aligns with what Pratt wants us to do. Pratt wants us to, thinks it is not justified to hate on indoor bats. D basically helps that. Which then leaves us with E, which is also distressingly an elimination. People are more likely to be aware of having been bitten by a bat if they were bitten by a bat inside a building. This is another nothing burger, increased awareness of having been bitten by an indoor bat. Just like C, what does awareness do? So linking the indoor bats to awareness fails to tell us anything about how much of a rabies threat indoor bats are to humans. And if anything, if we're being maximally charitable to E, we can kind of see it as a strengthener because, between not even realizing you got bit by a rabbit bat and having been bitten and being aware of having been bitten by a rabbit bat, you would probably want to be aware rather than unaware, right? And so if you happen to be more aware and therefore, let's say, just better prepared, I guess, to react to being bitten by an indoor bat, that's perhaps even less of a reason to be especially bothered by indoor bats. But again, it probably sounds stupid because it is stupid. Like this is the important point is we don't really know what the impact of awareness is. We have to make up a whole entire story that I was trying to make up just now, as you saw. There's no reason to do that. This E is just like C. It attaches indoor bats to something that we don't know anything about, in this case, awareness. And so that attachment, that extra piece of information, doesn't push anything one way or the other. And so, distressingly, like I said, we have now eliminated all five answers. So, start doing some reconsiderations. And so, the big thing with reconsideration is I did find specific issues with each single answer choice, but now I have to ask myself on second pass, do any of them have at least some alignment with my expectation? I.e., do any of them give us even a small reason, any reason at all, to go hard against indoor bats? So looking at them again, A does not meet this standard, so that's a no. I'm not rehabilitating this one. As A is written, there's simply nothing that pulls us closer to the go hard against indoor bats idea. To reach that go hard against indoor bats idea from where A leaves us, we'd have to completely invent a narrative that somehow connects bats give rabies to other bats with bats give rabies to humans, and A does not actually offer us anything to help us with that. It forces us to do it on our own. So just like on our first assessment, I don't like this one. B, I now need to grudgingly upgrade to a maybe. I want to emphasize, I still do not know if the more aggressive part outweighs the less mobile part. I don't know that. But at least the much more aggressive part, and thereby more threatening to humans factor, it's natively provided by B. All we have to do to make B work is simply assume that the balance favors the much more aggressive part over the much less mobile part. And although that assumption is still problematic to me in comparison to A, it at least requires a lot less outright fabrication. Because remember, A just completely leaves blank that link that we absolutely need between bats giving rabies to other bats and somehow that translating into bats giving rabies to humans. We've got to invent that. And here, although we technically need to sort of invent the assumption that the balance goes favors the aggressive part, at least they give us the balance. So all we have to do is just basically say, okay, here is a balance. We're just going to assume that happens. I feel like there's more logical distance between A and where we need to be versus B. Again, I want to emphasize, I still think this is a deeply imperfect answer. I'm talking about B here because I just don't have any basis for making that assumption. I just know that in making that assumption, I can fix it, and that fixing seems to be less extreme than what I saw in A, and hopefully the other answers as well. But let's keep going. So C. C, I'm going to give a similar treatment to A. Like I said previously, it's still a nothing burger. This one connects bats to other animals that carry rabies. And so, similarly to A, we need to completely fabricate a connection that takes us from these other animals that carry rabies all the way to we need to go all against these other animals. And by comparison, we should similarly go all out against bats, right? So there's in essence two narratives that we need to construct if we want to be really really critical. Either way, it's too much work. B represents a little bit less work than C does, a little bit less outright invention, we'll say. D similarly is going to stay in an elimination for me. To twist this one into a weakener, like I said previously, we'd have to somehow spin the idea that indoor bats probably don't have rabies into indoor bats are a huge rabies threat. And remember, this was a strengthener. So yeah, if that sounds dumb and weird to you, it's because it is dumb and weird. Like, why would we do this on behalf of an answer choice? It makes no sense. We're basically saying indoor bats don't even have rabies. And then somehow we have to translate that into, well, we should still be super afraid of them. That would require massive invention. Absolutely not. And E, thankfully, I think still looks pretty ridiculous for similar reasons that we saw in our first pass. Just like A, C, and D, this answer does require us to invent an entire narrative that connects awareness of being bitten to indoor bats are a huge rabies threat. It may be a little bit less ridiculous sounding in essence than the narrative that we'd have to invent for an answer like D, perhaps, but it doesn't change the fact that we still have to make it up entirely. The answer itself provides absolutely no help in connecting those 2 points. B, again, at least connects the 2 points that are connected, and it also gives us the mechanism that they're sort of they're counterbalancing facts. So the amount of invention we have to do is very little. We're actually just really interpreting the story that B gives us in a particular way. We don't have to invent the story outright. So I grudgingly select B. This is the only one that at least does something that I was looking for. It has some element of why indoor bats are particularly dangerous. The orange text about still not knowing if much more aggressive outweighs less mobile, that is still a problem. I still haven't come to a place where I feel like that's been resolved. So yeah, I maintain that B is still a terrible answer, but it is just simply the least terrible of the five. And if you thought 14 was bad, which it really was, 21 honestly wasn't a lot better, at least in my experience. This is a flaw question here from the same section. Um, The reasoning in the farmer's argument is most vulnerable to criticism on which of the following grounds. So let's see what our farmer says here. The stimulus: farming with artificial fertilizers, though more damaging to the environment than organic farming, allows more food to be grown on the same amount of land. So kind of doing like what I did with 14. I'm just going to stop after P1 and P2 here just to take stock of what's going on. And it seems to set up a pretty clear and pretty straightforward trade-off. Artificial fertilizers definitely have a drawback to them. They're environmentally worse, but there is a benefit to doing it. So like, yeah, cost benefit, counterbalance, push pull, whatever you want to call it, trade-offs. That's what's being described here. And the benefit that you get for the price of damaging the environment is to get more food than organic farming, which presumably means not using artificial fertilizers. So let's keep pushing. And here we actually get yet another premise. If everyone, if all farmers were to practice organic farming, they would be unable to produce enough food for Earth's growing population. So yeah, if everyone went towards the organic farming method, not enough food production. And that finally leads us to a conclusion: if enough food is to be produced, the currently popular practice of organic farming must not spread any further. And so, yeah, I mean, so we do have the word popular in here. I didn't really feel that was important enough because popular is, what does that mean? What does popular really mean? Does it mean more than half? Does it mean less than half? Does it mean close to 100%? We don't know. That's a word like some. It just means not zero essentially. So yeah, I don't really see any need to key into the word popular. So the analysis of what I see here, P1 and P2, like I said, tell a straightforward story of trade-offs. Artificial fertilizers are bad in one regard, but they're good, superior in another regard compared to organic farming. P3 is the first sign of logical problems on the horizon for me. There's nothing inherently wrong logically with what P3 says, but I feel like what it's saying is definitely tapping into a taken into extremities mindset. So instead of just talking about how artificial fertilizer farming compares, relatively speaking, than organic farming, they push it to if every single farmer went organic, then we get problems. Like, okay, I mean, that might be true, but why do you feel the need to turn it up to 100 like immediately? Are we at 100? Are we close to 100? There's a lot of questions that immediately arise from the fact that they pushed it all the way out to if everyone goes organic, we've got problems. And then the conclusion really does continue this bad extremities trend from P3. The only time, like I said, we know that organic farming amounts to a problem is when every farmer goes organic. And that was clearly laid out in P3. It's when every farmer goes organic that there's problems. However, the conclusion here insists that we have to cut off organic farming where it is right now to maintain adequate food production. But why do we have to freeze organic farming's progress right now for food production purposes? The problem is that we have no clue how close we are to the problem level of organic farming, and to unpack that even further, we don't even know that the problem level of organic farming only exists at the 100% level. Yes, it is true that we would have problems indeed if everyone went organic, but maybe we would also have problems if like 96% of people went organic. They don't really tell us if there's a range to the problem zone, right? All we are told is that when we reach the maximum, that's when problems are for sure are happening. That doesn't eliminate the possibility that problems are happening before we even reach that point. But even then, the problem is we are not told, so we don't know. We don't know if there's problems hit earlier. We don't know if the problems don't hit until we reach that exact 100% point. We just don't know. The arguer hasn't told us anything, but they're pretending like they have. So my expectation is basically the yellow stuff that I have on the slide here. So I've reproduced my expectation from the previous slide here. Take a minute to read it if you kind of breeze past it on the last slide. But I'm just going to take this right now and push into answer choices. So A is an elimination. It takes for granted that farming with artificial fertilizers is only slightly more damaging to the environment than organic farming is. We really don't care about how bad non-organic or even how good organic farming actually is. My focus, my issue, my expectation is purely highlighting our lack of knowledge regarding why organic farming must be stopped where it is now for food production reasons. So A doesn't do any of that, so it's dead. B B is weird, guys. B is super weird. B says it overlooks the possibility that even if the practice of organic farming continues to spread, many farmers will choose not to adopt it. What, I mean, what does that really even mean? In my mind, the spread of a practice is synonymous with adopting that practice. How does a practice even spread if nobody is adopting it? None of the core logic, none of it makes any sense to me. However, I always like to acknowledge, as I said on the first slide, I like to acknowledge when my distaste for an answer is based almost purely on confusion versus a clear logical disagreement with whatever core idea it has. So, true to form, if forced to, I'll come back to this one to see if there's any merit to the spread versus adopt word games, but I'm not going to do it now. Also, I do acknowledge that there may be some unpacking here because um, there is no language of like, you know, invoking the all versus some thing, and that was something that I was looking for. But maybe there's a gap between the spread of the practice and the adopt. And they are saying that many people will not want to choose to adopt it. So I mean, I'm beginning to see the possibility, but the core idea of separating the idea of the spread of a practice from the adoption of that practice, it just really doesn't make sense to me. It really doesn't speak to me. Moving into C. C says it fails to consider the possibility that at some points in human history, enough food was produced to feed Earth's population without the use of artificial fertilizers. It doesn't matter if pure organic farming was enough for production at some point in the past. The premise is clearly established that current population growth plus further spread of organic farming, that's the setup that they say is going to lead to production problems. So the sort of rooting things in current trends plus future needs essentially negates any consideration of what's happened in the past. So C is dead. D is tough. I'm assuming that the I haven't looked at the data for this, but if any of you guys do seven stage or anything like that, I'm sure you can see it. This is probably the number one wrong answer. It is extremely tempting. However, it's wrong purely because of the way it is phrased. So D says it overlooks the possibility that a consequence that would surely follow if all farmers adopted the practice of organic farming, i.e., food shortages, would still ensue if even not all of them did. And so, at first glance, it looks like, oh, that's exactly what your expectation says. But remember, we do have to look at how the answer choice is phrased. My expectation states that our issue with this argument is precisely the fact that the arguer outright assumes that current, non 100% levels of organic farming are problematic already, while D accuses the arguer of overlooking that very assumption that we are accusing the arguer of making. So yeah, that's the simple reason why D, as tempting as it is not the right answer. Again, our whole shtick is that excuse me, our whole shtick is that our arguer overly strongly accounts for the idea that even less than complete levels of organic farming are already a problem. And so it's impossible to say, like D alleges, that our arguer has overlooked that very same assumption. Like I said, LR really, really sucks. Like this is a super troll move, a super duper troll move. Moving into E, this one is also an elimination. E says it takes for granted that damage to the environment due to the continued use of artificial fertilizers would not be detrimental to human health. This is pretty much just a slightly different version of A. It invokes issues, environment, and health that are completely outside of my expectations and are irrelevant to consideration. So yeah, if I hadn't caught that D was a super duper troll move where it sounds exactly like my expectation, except for the one word overlook. I think I would have picked D like a lot of you guys probably did and gotten this one wrong. But going forward, so that brings us to another five eliminations, and I have to do some reconsideration making. It's going to turn out a little bit differently than the other one. I think A, C, and E are all very safe to keep eliminated, and I have to. I as heartbreaking as it is, I have to keep D on this list as well. Nothing can really fix the overlook issue for D. It's just way too clear. Our issue again with D is that um, we believe our arguer clearly made and accounted for a problematic assumption, whereas D is alleging that our arguer has overlooked and failed to account for that very assumption. It's just not possible to rehabilitate D. So at this point, I could and should just pick B despite my initial misgivings about it. But in reality, my near total confusion about the spread versus adopt thing, which in retrospect wasn't like that big of a problem when it comes to answer choice. But when I was reading it the first time, it just didn't compute. It just simply did not compute. Um, and that confusion led to also a refusal to engage with B more deeply on first pass. That all put together makes it a good idea to fully reconsider B anyways. If you're running out of time, because this is near the end of the section, it's question 21, I would say don't bother and just pick B. But now that we're here for academic purposes, let's just see what it looks like. So I have to upgrade B to a grudging maybe. It still doesn't look great. It isn't perfect. And just like the correct answer B from 14, I still think it retains some unresolved problems, but I can see that it has some hope of being salvaged. I still have serious logical objections to this whole spread versus adopt thing. I think it's laughable to say that practice has somehow spread, although nobody actually adopted it. Um, I realize this isn't a problem in retrospect again because they're not saying complete adoption; they're talking about widespread adoption. So, widespread adoption may or may not be complete. That's one of the unresolved problems. But at the very same time, I don't have to see it in as clear black and white terms as I have this whole time in terms of spread versus adopt. It is possible in my mind for practice to spread, but for some people to remain outside of the spread and still refuse to adopt it. That's a possibility that I did not really see early on in my first pass because I was just so confused by the dichotomy being set up. But I do see that something is relevant beneath the surface here. If I can just get past the spread versus adopting in the manner that I just described, B is indeed setting up a scenario where one, we don't have to stop organic farming from spreading any further if two, there's enough farmers in that many farmers group who don't end up adopting organic farming. So again, if there's enough of a split or a balance, right, such that the balance of organic versus non-organic farmers might stay far enough below 100% organic for us to avoid food shortages. And so I do want to highlight the fact that we don't know that the the scenario set up by B for sure guarantees that our arguer is wrong, but it does highlight something that our arguer has not fully accounted for. The arguer is just basically saying, hey, if we reach this point, full organic farming, we're screwed. And then their conclusion is we gotta stop organic farming right now, right where it is, right? That was the whole thing. But B is setting up a world where organic farming can continue to spread. We don't need to stop it right now because there's going to be enough people who say no to organic farming anyways that maybe there's a shred of possibility that we will not reach that problematic level of organic farming. Again, we don't know that we're safe for sure. Again, there's a lot of questions about, is 100% the only problem number? Is it 90%? Where's the cutoff? We don't know. And honestly, at this point, we can't care. But at least B leaves open the possibility of fitting our expectations. So, as I've been saying just now, despite all the unresolved problems that I've been mentioning with B, I have to acknowledge that most of the pieces are in place. Just like in question 14's correct answer B, all I need to do here really is to add um, the element 3 here above to make it align with my expectations. Answer choice B clearly sets out 1 and 2 already, that we don't have to stop organic farming from spreading any further because there's people who um, may not end up adopting it anyways, even if the practice spreads. And the only real unknown is that we don't know for sure if the holdouts who don't do organic farming are going to be enough to help stave off food production. But at the same time, we have to invent less to make B work than all the others. So I grudgingly end up selecting B here. So the third and final question I'll discuss from this section for today's video is number 25, which is a parallel flaw question. This one honestly isn't as terrible as the other two that we've discussed here, but it was hard for me to choose the correct answer on first pass because of both the question type. We all know that parallel flaw, parallel reasoning are kind of beefy, and where it was at the section. It happens to be the very last question, running out of time, energy, patience, all those things. So let's look at the stimulus here. Which one of the following arguments is most similar in its flawed reasoning to the argument above? It starts off by telling us that Stallworth claims that she supported the proposal to build the new community center. So Stallworth claims to have supported this proposal. Um, if Henning also supported the proposal, it would have received government approval. I'll just shorten that to if Henning also supported the proposal, it would have passed. Um, which leads us to this next premise, which is that the proposal, in fact, did not pass. Um, And that leads us to a conclusion finally that since the proposal did not gain government approval, um, Henning must have failed to back it despite his claims to the contrary. And so I do feel like I have to tag on this last P4 here. I didn't know what Henning claimed or didn't claim about it in P2, but the conclusion does add on this last bit of premise that Henning did in fact actually make this claim to support the proposal. The analysis isn't too bad for this one. If we just take P1 through P4 here, it leads to the conclusion that at least one of the two people in question didn't support the proposal and is thus the line. Stallworth claims to have supported the proposal. Henning claims to support the proposal. If both of them had done what they said, um, we're told, premise three, two tells us that it would have passed, and premise three though reveals that it did not pass. So we know that one of those two people isn't being truthful here. The weird thing is that the conclusion just chooses to accuse Henning of lying, which I find strange. I mean, P1 went so far as to specify that Stallworth only claimed to support the proposal, just as Henning only claimed to support the proposal. There's nothing more certain about Stallworth's behavior versus Henning's. Why just assume that Stallworth wasn't lying as well? Why is it all on Henning? So my expectation is, again, rather straightforward. If both parties just did what they said, we would have won. But we didn't win. The conclusion ends up singling out and accusing just one of the parties of lying without explanation. That's my issue. So, with that expectation in mind, let's go into answer choices. Starting with A. According to the TV news, the traffic accident occurred on Aylmer Street, but if the accident occurred on Aylmer Street, Morgan could not have witnessed it from his kitchen window. I'm already getting weird vibes here. Is Morgan the other party? What's going on? Thus, the newspaper report, so newspaper versus TV versus Morgan, was mistaken in its claim that Morgan witnessed the accident from his kitchen window. So it's not the clean fit that I'm used to in parallel reasoning, parallel flaw situations. While there does seem to be a competing narratives element to all this, so like who's right, TV or newspaper. Because I always feel rushed on more massive parallel reasoning, parallel flaw questions. Um, I sort of panic refuse to unpack this one more deeply. And in my initial reading, if I'm recalling correctly, yeah, I especially was really weirded out by the fact that Morgan seemed to play a role. I wasn't sure because of the speed at which I was moving if Morgan constituted a third competing party. If we need to question Morgan's account of having seen it, in addition to the TV's account and the newspaper's account. I'll reconsider this one if need be, but I'm not comfortable eliminating it or selecting it at this point. B is an elimination. Um, so if we look at B, um, according to the city government, 50% of city residents are behind on their property taxes. But according to a private institute, property taxes in the city are far higher than national average for cities of that size. Thus, it is the city government that is to blame for the high percentage of residents who are behind on their taxes. And as I was starting to say here, I eliminated B because although deeply imperfect, there at least is an attempt in B at offering an explanation to take sides. So the explanation here is the questionable comparison to other cities, and that explanation is, despite how insufficient it is, that is nonetheless an attempt to explain why the arguer is blaming the government and absolving the residents for the tax collection situation. So again, I'm not saying that B is actually logically sound. All I'm saying is that it's not doing the same thing that original stimulus does. The original stimulus just basically threw Henning under the bus and absolved Stallworth and had no explanation for it. Here, we're throwing the government under the bus and absolving the citizens, but there is a imperfect, but there still is an explanation for it. C is another elimination. According to Kapoor, the hazardous waste disposal site does not pose an imminent danger to the community, but according to Galindo, the disposal site is located, on an unsuitable tract of land. Thus, if Galindo is correct, Kapoor's assessment is an error. This one doesn't single out a clear liar, loser, scapegoat. It just ends on if one party is right, the other is wrong. This is not at all what our original argument was doing. D is another elimination. According to Harris's political rivals, she consistently favors the interests of property developers. A good mayor must be willing to stand up to the city's powerful interests, including property developers. Harris is thus a poor choice for mayor. I think a lot of people might find this somewhat tempting at first pass, but I considered this an elimination. Really, primarily because we don't have a clue about what Harris says or wants us to believe. I have a hard time trying to squeeze this into my expectation of competing narratives and arbitrarily hating on one of the narratives for no reason. Yes, it's true that our argument here in D doesn't give us a reason to disbelieve Harris and believe her rivals, but that's the problem. I don't know what I'm supposed to believe about Harris. We don't even know if Harris would deny being partial to property developers. And I don't know if you guys, follow your local politics at all, but if you're a suburban kid like me, something that you may have heard your local officials say is that, hey, we get along. I so and so candidate for mayor or city council or whatever, get along with these property developers. I can work with them and I will bring homes, construction, and jobs and all this other cool stuff to our community. And so, to me, that might be a little bit of cheating and bringing outside knowledge, but it just highlights the idea that we don't actually know that Harris wants us to believe anything different than what her rivals say. She might be like, she might pull a Trump on us and be like, yeah, I am exactly that thing that my opponents accuse me of, and it's an awesome thing. Go me, right? That might be what Harris is doing. And so, because there really isn't a competing narrative from Harris regarding the property developer issue and the candidacy issue, I don't see any way to squeeze D into the expectation that I have. That leads me to E, which I also called an elimination. This is more like one party, the government, versus straight up reality. So let's see how this plays out. According to the latest government figures, the regional unemployment rate declined in the last 6 months, but the region lost thousands of manufacturing jobs in that period. That's the reality part. There's a premise here. The region just straight up lost jobs. This is nobody like claiming that this happened. This is offered as a premise. This happened. It's reality. The government's unemployment figures must therefore be inaccurate. So, choosing to believe reality over Party B's narrative with no explanation seems quite different from choosing Party A's narrative versus Party B's narrative for no explanation. So, yeah, to me, we had no basis for believing Stallworth over Henning in the original argument. E shares that basic structure of not having an explanation, but at the same time, the explanation is inherent to the fact that one of the premises is not somebody's narrative or claim. The other one of the premises is just the reality on the ground. The cold hard facts of the ground just say this area lost jobs, so somebody has to be wrong. And again, just like B, I'm not saying that the argument in E is actually sound. We can probably pull apart. I'm just looking at. I'm not going to. Yeah, it's there's probably like a relative versus absolute issue there, but we don't even need to get into that because the opposition of reality versus one potential liar is different from the opposite between one potential liar and another potential liar. That's a very different thing to me. So I could probably fairly safely just select A at this point, given that my problem with it was mostly mere uncertainty um, versus more clearly identifiable beefs in all the others. But I still reassessed it in practice, so that's what I'll do here for you guys as well. So reconsidering A, unlike question 14 and I believe 21 was the other one I did. On second pass, I actually did like this one. It wasn't as nearly as grudging of a choice as the other two. So, like I saw in my first pass, I did see that the TV news and the newspaper are set up as the competing parties by the conclusion, and this is good. This is pretty parallel to what I'm seeing. So, just like Stallworth versus Henning, we've got TV news versus the newspaper. I also see that both parties' narratives have a clear link to a singular outcome, being accurate in reporting. This one was a little less comfortable to me than the first element that I just discussed because I didn't feel like the tone and nature of what was at stake was a clean fit with the win, didn't win part of my expectation. But at the very least, I saw that there was a binary here. So in answer choice A, the binary outcome is accurate versus inaccurate reporting. And I can line that up against the proposal pass versus didn't pass of the original argument. So this is forgivable. It's not quite as rock solid as the binary, the two parties thing, but it's up there. It's workable for me. And on closer inspection this time around, I'm no longer worried about Morgan's place. If you recall, my concern in my sort of fast, superficial reading of A was that I was concerned that Morgan was being offered as a third party, but here, now that I look at it, Morgan is simply the interview subject of both the TV news and the newspaper, and Morgan is not a third party injecting their competing narrative, vying to have us believe it over the other two. So this is good. This is good. That means that Morgan is kind of playing the role of the proposal in a sense. It is just kind of just it's just Morgan's just kind of there. And finally, just like in the original argument, Answer choice A here just chooses to disbelieve a newspaper with no explanation. This is rock solid. This is good. So it turns out my one initial concern about Morgan was moot, and the new concern that I had upon reconsideration, my inability to plug as neatly as I prefer into the win aspect of my expectation, was also moot because I had shifted away from sticking to my win language in my prephrase to the sort of binary that I came up with here, and I feel that's workable enough. So when none of the answers respect a piece of your expectation, just like I saw with the orange bit here, there's little reason to insist on it. I could sit there and just be like, I don't see a win loss thing, but I mean, none of the other answer choices did the win loss thing like I was doing anyway. So, I mean, I didn't really see a need to really insist on seeing that in A as well. The catch is that when you are beginning to abandon pieces of your expectation, you need to know that none of the answers, in fact, um, do not meet your expectation, not that you are misinterpreting them and failing to see that, or failing to detect that any of these answer choices do, in fact, fit your expectation. So, again, when your expectation, generally try to stick to your guns as much as possible, but strategically abandon pieces of your expectation as soon as you are sure that none of the answers speak to it. And you have to, and this, easier said than done, right? You do have to read carefully, where you do have to make sure that none of the answers are just kind of agreeing with you, but not making it obvious that they are. So yeah, you want to avoid that. But outside of that, if it's clear that none of the answer choices respect your expectation in full, be more willing to abandon pieces of it as necessary. The takeaways here is that really that LR can be truly brutal in its capacity to force you to choose very unattractive answers. Having a set way to make your initial approach and then carefully deviating when necessary, that can help ease the pain here. It's just the problem with all this is the highly fluid nature of that second part, carefully deviating when necessary. Understandably, most of you are seeking some sort of defined or at least controlled way to both deviate and determine when doing so is necessary, right? Now, stick to your guns until you can't, right? Or until it turns out that you shouldn't. But when do you make those decisions? Understandably, you guys are looking for something less vague when it comes to making that decision. To that end, I did provide a 6 item list of how I go about all this in general on the first slide, but really, and the more that I look at it, that list is a betrayal of the actual fluidity, back and forth, self-questioning, all that kind of stuff that I find honestly difficult to portray faithfully in a recording. I am pretty sure that most, if not all, other existing LSAT content that's on the internet right now fares worse in this regard than I do. But that doesn't mean that I have a long way to go. And I don't even know if it's even possible to make it right to that place where my material, faithfully, fully reflects really the fluidity and back and forth that it takes for me to reach these things that I'm recording here. I guess what I could start doing is if I sometimes I skip answer choices very early on, I could just be clear about that. But I mean, I generally do go in alphabetical order, and I do loop back as I've shown in here. It's just that the end result still it still looks a little prepackaged, and again, that might just be a function of the fact that I am recording this ahead of time for a general audience instead of it being a live conversation between you and me personally. So that might be it. I don't know if I can ever get over that. That's not going to stop me from trying, not occasionally, but moving forward. But yeah, I just feel like that is an important thing to say here, given how it looks and how I feel like it really is in reality. Looks kind of different. So if you made it this far, thanks for watching algorithmic stuff. Leave a comment, or if you want to get in touch with me here, that's my name, that's my email. Get in touch with me, and we'll go from there. And I'll see you in the next one.